go with the new brush, start that new section this morning, okay? All right. We're working on one of our larger jobs here today, painting the interior and the exterior of this place. Hopefully we estimated the right quantity of the paint to do the job. Now, since we're constantly transporting various paints and paint thinners, is there a quantity of paint that we're allowed to transport before we're subject to regulations that require shipping papers and placards?
We have the opportunity to witness firsthand the change of seasons, and with that change bring different environmental concerns and demands. As you can see, we use a lot of gasoline-powered equipment. Are there limits to the amounts of gasoline we can carry? And are there special restrictions to the types of gas containers we can use?
I'll be there as soon as I can. You're welcome. Well, in this profession, you can pretty much expect any type of distress call at any time of the day. We try to keep our vehicles well equipped for a variety of situations, from small brass fittings to a propane torch. Now, with regard to materials of trade, are there certain markings or labeling requirements needed for the items that I transport?
Hazardous materials are used in many businesses. There always seem to be some good questions when it comes to transporting hazardous materials, especially as they pertain to the regulations we must follow. Whether you are self-employed or work for a large company, you may be transporting some hazardous materials as part of your job. Before we begin to answer these important questions, let's first make sure we understand what hazardous materials are. A hazardous material is a substance or material which has been determined by the U.S. Department of Transportation to be capable of posing an unreasonable risk to health, safety, and property when transported in commerce. This definition is found in the requirements for transporting hazardous materials, known as the Hazardous Materials Regulations, or HMR, issued by the U.S. Department of Transportation's Research and Special Programs Administration. The HMR were put into effect to protect people and the environment from the dangers associated with hazardous materials. They can be found in 49 CFR Parts 100 through 185. Accidents involving hazardous materials can have serious consequences. Safe transportation procedures are important, and so is a standardized system of regulation. These concerns prompted an amendment to the Hazardous Materials Regulations to include transportation by persons that stay in one state. The amendment took effect on October 1, 1998. It applies the Hazardous Materials Regulations to all highway transportation, not just transportation by interstate carriers, in the same manner that the HMR have applied to railroad, aircraft, vessels, and interstate motor carriers for many years. Each state also regulates what is transported on highways within the state. All states have adopted the federal regulations as state requirements. However, when there are any conflicts, federal regulations take precedence over state regulations. In most instances, motor carriers transporting hazardous materials must comply with the state statutes and municipal ordinances. The HMR does not nullify or supersede these laws. Only when there is a conflict do the federal regulations take precedence. If you ship or transport hazardous materials in the course of your business, you are required to comply with the Hazardous Materials Regulations. One of the important parts of the HMR for businesses that transport hazardous materials as part of their activities is the Materials of Trade exception found in Section 173.6. If the materials you use in your business meet the definition of materials of trade found in Section 171.8 and are within the limitations and quantities described in the HMR, Section 173.6, you may be subject to less regulation because of the limited hazards that these materials pose. Material of trade means a hazardous material other than hazardous waste that is carried on a motor vehicle for the purpose of protecting the health and safety of the motor vehicle operator or passengers, for the purpose of supporting the operation or maintenance of a motor vehicle, including its auxiliary equipment, or by a private motor carrier, including vehicles operated by a rail carrier, in direct support of a principal business that is other than transportation by motor vehicle. Let's look at some examples of materials of trade. If a hazardous material is carried on a motor vehicle to protect the health and safety of the operator or passengers, like a fire extinguisher or insect repellent, it's considered a material of trade. If you transport gasoline or a spare battery to support the operation or maintenance of your motor vehicle, this too is a material of trade. If a material is carried to support a principal business, not a transportation business, such as a welding or painting business, this also may qualify as a material of trade. Be aware that it is your responsibility to know if you are transporting a hazardous material and the requirements in the HMR that apply. When it is a material of trade, there are lesser requirements, but the HMR still apply. For example, there are still packaging and marking requirements, but no shipping paper is necessary and placards aren't required. Formal training is not required for transporting materials of trade, but the operator of a motor vehicle that contains a material of trade must be informed of the presence of the hazardous material and must be aware of the requirements of materials of trade exceptions found in Section 173.6. As noted earlier, the definition in Section 171.8 and exceptions for materials of trade in Section 173.6 are in the Hazardous Materials Regulations. These regulations, found in 49 CFR Parts 100 through 185, are an excellent resource for you, and a copy can be obtained through several means. It's available on the Internet at two different locations: www.access.gpo.nara or www.rspa.dot.gov. It can be purchased from the Government Printing Office, and it is available from private vendors on the Commercial Suppliers List found in the Publications section on the RSPA website. The average cost is about $50, and revised copies are printed annually. Make sure the version you have is the most current. This publication will inform you of a general knowledge of hazardous materials regulations, quantity limitations, packaging requirements, and marking and labeling requirements as they relate to materials of trade. As we mentioned earlier, materials defined as materials of trade do not require shipping papers, emergency response information, placarding, formal training, record keeping, or labeling, except cylinders as described in Section 173.6C3. While it is certainly acceptable to do so, it is not necessary. If your line of business involves the shipping or transporting of other hazardous materials, you must follow requirements under the Hazardous Materials Regulations. These federal regulations require specific packaging and particular shipping paper information as it relates to the material being transported. To be a material of trade, the hazardous material must fit into any one of the following classes or divisions. Flammable gases, Division 2.1, such as acetylene or propane. Non-flammable gases, Division 2.2, such as oxygen or nitrogen. Flammable or combustible liquids, Class 3, such as paint, paint thinner, or gasoline. Flammable solids, Division 4.1, such as charcoal. Dangerous when wet materials, Division 4.3, such as fumigants. Oxidizers, Division 5.1, such as bleaching compounds. Organic peroxides, Division 5.2, such as benzoyl peroxide. Poisons, Division 6.1, such as certain pesticides. Some infectious substances, Division 6.2, such as diagnostic specimens. Corrosive materials, Class 8, such as hydrochloric acid, drain cleaners, or battery acid. Miscellaneous hazardous materials, Class 9, such as asbestos or self-inflating lifeboats, and consumer commodities, ORMD, such as hairspray or spray paint. To better understand how hazardous materials are classified, it is important that you understand the use and meaning of the term packing group. Most hazardous materials are categorized into one of three packing groups. These groups represent the degree of danger presented by the hazardous material. Packing Group 1 indicates that the material poses a great danger, while Packing Group 2 means medium danger, and Packing Group 3 represents minor danger. In addition to being limited by class or division, there are also quantity limits for hazardous materials that are transported as materials of trade. Let's examine per package quantity limits for materials of trade you may be transporting. If the hazardous material is a high hazard material, packing group 1, the maximum amount of material in one package is 0.5 kilogram or 1 pound for solids, or 0.5 liter or 1 pint for liquids. If the hazardous material is a medium or lower hazard belonging to packing group 2 or 3, other than division 4.3 or consumer commodities, the maximum amount of material in each package is 30 kilograms or 66 pounds for solids, or 30 liters or 8 gallons for liquids. Each cylinder containing a gas, division 2.1 or 2.2, may not weigh more than 100 kilograms or 220 pounds, and a diluted mixture of a Class 9 material, not exceeding 2% concentration, may be transported in a tank having a capacity of up to 1,500 liters or 400 gallons. With the exception of tanks containing diluted mixtures of Class 9 materials, no more than a combined gross weight of 200 kilograms or 440 pounds of materials of trade can be transported on any one vehicle. Materials of trade also have packaging and marking requirements which help increase safety. Be sure to use the manufacturer's original packaging or a packaging of equal or greater strength. The packaging must be marked with a common name such as gas or spray paint, or a proper shipping name from the HMR such as isopropyl alcohol. Packaging must be leak-tight for liquids and gases and be sift-proof for solids. Packages must be securely closed, secured against movement, and protected against damage. Outer packagings are not required for receptacles, such as cans or bottles, that are secured against movement in cages, bins, boxes, or compartments. Gasoline must be transported in a metal or plastic container meeting DOT or OSHA requirements. Cylinders and pressure vessels must conform to the HMR except that outer packagings are not required. These cylinders must be marked with the proper shipping name and identification number and have a hazard class warning label. If the package contains a reportable quantity of a hazardous substance, it must be marked RQ. Reportable quantities are found in Appendix A of Section 172.101 of the HMR. A tank containing a diluted mixture, not more than 2% concentration, of a Class 9 material must be marked on two opposing sides with the identification number for the material either on orange panels, a white square on point configuration, or on an authorized placard. Now that you've learned the basics of operating under the Materials of Trade regulations, let's test your knowledge in responding to our earlier questions.
Is there a quantity of paint that we're allowed to transport before we're subject to regulations that require shipping papers and placards?
The type of paint used determines if it is a hazardous material. For instance, lacquer, enamel, and stain-based paints are considered hazardous. Generally, paint is considered a flammable or combustible liquid, Class 3, but some may be corrosive, Class 8. The material is then assessed according to its designated packing group. So to answer your original question, yes, there are quantity limits on how much Class 3 or Class 8 paint defined as a material of trade you can transport. The maximum amount per packaging is 0.5 kilogram, or 1 pound, or 0.5 liter, 1 pint, of a Class 3 or Class 8 material in Packing Group 1. For Packing Groups 2 and 3, the maximum amount per packaging is 30 kilograms, 66 pounds, or 30 liters, 8 gallons. The aggregate gross weight of all materials of trade on a motor vehicle may not exceed 200 kilograms, 440 pounds.
Are there limits to the amounts of gasoline we can carry? And are there special restrictions to the types of gas containers we can use?
Yes, on both accounts. Gasoline is categorized as a flammable liquid, Class 3, and falls under Packing Group 2, which represents a moderate hazard. Therefore, the maximum amount of gasoline that can be transported in one container is 30 liters, 8 gallons. The total combined gross weight of all materials of trade transported on an individual vehicle may not exceed 200 kilograms, 440 pounds, except tanks carrying 2% or less of a diluted mixture of Class 9 materials. Gasoline must be transported in a metal or plastic container meeting DOT or OSHA requirements.
We try to keep our vehicles well equipped for a variety of situations, from small brass fittings to a propane torch. Now, with regard to materials of trade, are there certain markings or labeling requirements needed for the items that I transport?
A plumber's propane torch is a Division 2.1 flammable gas. Each cylinder containing a Division 2.1 or 2.2 material may not weigh more than 100 kilograms, 220 pounds. And yes, certain marking and labeling requirements do apply. Cylinders and pressure vessels must conform to the hazardous materials regulations, except that outer packagings are not required. These cylinders must be marked with the contents' proper shipping name and identification number and have a hazard class label. If the package contains a reportable quantity of a hazardous substance, it must be marked RQ. Packages must be leak-tight, closed, and secured in a vehicle against movement and damage. As you have just seen, understanding the materials of trade regulations involves knowing the quantity limitations, packaging requirements, as well as marking and labeling requirements for the materials you use. While these regulations are extensive and detailed because they apply to many different hazardous materials, you can learn how to use them with little time or effort. Become familiar with the materials of trade requirements and educate yourself about the materials you work with that are considered hazardous. If you have any questions or would like to obtain further information or training, be sure to visit the Research and Special Programs Administration Hazmat Safety homepage located at www.rspa.dot.gov. You'll be able to view the hazardous materials regulations, copies of the latest rulemakings, exemptions, clarifications of regulations, plus hazmat publications and training schedules. The Hazardous Materials Information Center is also a valuable resource. Many of your questions can be answered by calling 1-800-467-4922. Thanks for your time and attention in learning about the rules for transporting materials of trade and how they apply to your working operations. Remember that these regulations were not put in place to hinder your work or confuse you, but rather they protect you, the environment, and those around you. We hope that you will continue to educate and update yourself with such information as we use hazardous materials in our daily lives, at home, and in our businesses.